salad tomorrow.
Yay.
Can't think of anything, because I'm gonna cheat big time with your mom next
Oh,
week.
true. Is there a special kind of salad besides the salad you make at home that you would want?
No, nobody makes them as good as I do. Especially now that your mom hard-boiled some eggs for me, so that's always like the extra special treat. I don't think if there's anything I'd like to on the side. Where are you gonna stop?
I don't know. Just almost everything's nearby. Or I can do morning. I can leave in the morning and bring coffee if we want to.
I don't have coffee till noon. So maybe we do a coffee thing.
We do a coffee thing.
But it would be later. They don't do coffee till like 11 or 12.
And then I can sleep in a minute.
Yeah. And I go home usually around 11, sleep for a little bit, get up, have coffee, and then come back here. It's usually what I do. But if you're going to come here with coffee, then maybe a Starbucks or something.
Yeah, sleep word.
Starbucks.
So I always get it mixed up when I actually look at the three. Go right out of there. Just looking at where the Starbucks is going to take me to.
Which one are you going to?
That's the one. Capital City Market's 4 minutes away from me. Just make a right, a left, and it'd be right in here. Oh, that looks like it's a bit easier to get into than the. Because the other one, like off of, where is it, Cedar Street in Pennsylvania, the one we would always go to on Wednesdays. That one just looks like so much fun getting in and out of.
Oh, yeah.
That's scary.
Depends on the time of day.
It does.
And it's got that steep off the Cedar Street there. I don't like
remember us
that.
hitting that.
Yep.
It's also where we saw the infamous P-Way sign
That's
go
true.
across the street. I
It's
still have
got
that in my
special
Instagram
memories.
forever
Right. It's
immortalized.
got memories for it.
But yeah, no, I could do Starbucks, and then from Starbucks to
Church.
church, we'd be looking at, depending on the time of day, we'd be looking at 30 minutes, 40 minutes if I don't do highway driving. Because depending on the time of the day, it will.
So I like the grande mocha with at least another 1 or 2 shots of mocha sauce. That makes it super good.
Make a note.
Grande mocha, 2 extra shots of mocha sauce. That's what I always order.
I took that long.
And if you're there, just let me know. 'Cause I think maybe around.
It'd take me like 40 minutes. Let's say it takes me 45 minutes.
Once you plan on being here at 1.
At 1, so I'll be
Yeah.
here by 1.
Because I don't have any other meeting till 3, I think.
Okay. So we'll plan 1 p.m. So we'll do that. It'll be fun. And I
be
can
fun.
get like all that other stuff done. I was just talking to my manager. Like, just when I saw those emails come in, I just felt like physically recoiling just at the thought that it's just.
Most people would have said you shouldn't have done it. Just go with the flow,
And
Emma.
they're just like,
And Gulf
how
waves.
can you, how you know, kind of like that, how do you know somebody said this? I'm like, well, I have a screenshot I sent you, genius, and it shows you the name and department. I didn't say genius, sounded very much nicer. But
Yeah, they would have sensed the sarcasm.
they would have sensed, I think they've sensed some sarcasm already, at least. Jimmy Waters and better enough.
That's why you're just validating. You're just mean. Not nice like everybody else says.
I know, right? I'm not nice if all these other people call me bigot and other names.
Yep, the more
Italian.
perverse something is, the more, wow, you're just generous if you're okay with it. The way these people are.
I just love everybody, except for people who don't have these very specific long list of names. But that video that was going around of that Turkish MP, or like the Turkish lawmaker who dropped dead in front of everyone. So this Turkish lawmaker is having this meeting for all these people, and he was talking about Israel will be punished. Allah's going to like punish Israel. You know, maybe they suffer some threat like that. Within seconds, he dropped of a heart attack in front of everybody.
Ooh,
So
I didn't
last
see
I heard,
that.
he's in critical condition. I shared it
No,
with Sarah.
so he didn't drop dead. He's just,
Yeah,
he's in pretty bad shape.
But
Wow.
it was incredible watching the video. Just he says he just said,
Yeah.
and he just drops in front of everyone.
When you think of the lightning striking somebody.
Exactly. It was. I was like, interesting. So I shared that with Sarah. Did you see this? Okay, I'll let you get back to this. So at 1 p.m. tomorrow, we'll have Starbucks.
1 p.m., all right.
Like back
all right.
in the day.
That'll be nice. And then, yeah, just text me so I remember. And I don't, my only concern is drinking more coffee, and I don't want to do too much. So yeah, the Starbucks would be great. And my office will be warm. It'll be cold in here, but My ovals will be warm. No, but you can. Okay, it's time to start. I know we've got a lot downstairs, so we need to hurry up. Literally hurry up upstairs so we can get started. It is time to get started. I know most folks are here. I can smell that there's really good food downstairs. So I know it's probably hard to pull away if you haven't eaten much yet, but you can cautiously bring it up here. We won't complain. Okay, everyone working their way in. We're still, as far as notes are concerned, about halfway through 47, over to 48, that's back there, if you need it. No. Well, that's not gonna work. You're really early. Okay, hopefully everyone having a good day. Had a lunch meeting today on the board of the rescue mission, trying to figure out the budget for next year, and also then trying to figure out how we were going to potentially manage the new buildings, to procure them, and then about what construction's going to look like, where we were at on the possible sale of the buildings downtown. So it looks like a lot are going to hold out for a really low price for the buildings downtown, which we agreed today we will not do. So the strategy is to go ahead and procure the buildings, since we feel that that's where we have to go because the need's increasing, and then hang on to them for a little bit here until we've got enough to start a construction, and maybe piecemeal it out a little bit smaller in little pieces. We did have, and I don't know how this is going to affect her position on the board, but one of our board members, Tamara Carter, was voted in as one of the newest city council members for the city of Lansing. So that was very good. So she was talking a little about that today, hoping that might help us. It's interesting also that the rescue mission, if you're familiar with our work in the city, we started a few years ago a ministry called Outreach, which is for folks that are just in pretty bad shape, but they can't come into our shelters because they're high on drugs or drunk or something like that, but this would keep them out of the cold, give them a safe place. They've been averaging, I think, 50 plus, maybe sometimes almost 60 a night at the outreach that the city of Lansing, just to show how they're not a huge fan of us, put out an RFP, request for proposal, for a warming center for folks. And we didn't, of course, bid on it because it was for families. And it was awarded to the Detroit City Rescue Mission. And then as soon as they got it, apparently the requirements changed. So now it's just for men, older men. And I think they've been averaging a handful, maybe 2 or 3 from what Mark was sharing a night versus our 50 to 60 a night. And it's $250,000 to start with to support that ministry that the city's giving. So it just fascinates me that it's a direct slap in the face, because he said, actually, the city tells us they love us, they just can't say it openly and have to oppose us because we are truly a Christian ministry. So it's interesting to get that pushback, but we felt pretty secure, and the budget we're going for, it is a very faith-based budget because of now taking on payments on the new buildings there, and that's without any construction loan. But if we get the buildings downtown to sell for what we really need them to sell, then we'll be able to start that. So just a meeting update that we had today, and pray for us to make good decisions. We've got several here that work for the rescue mission in one capacity or another, and so we would hope that the ministry could stay comfortably on top of things. So I did tell Mark early on, I said, isn't it interesting how God's going to just keep forcing this whole faith issue with us? He's just not going to give us just loads and loads of money, so we don't have to worry about anything, as it were, in the supposed responsible sense. But he's proven we need it, but he hasn't given us all the money to get it into place. So we feel there's enough evidence to move forward, so we are with getting those buildings. That's at least what we voted on today. So, and that with on top of an aggressive budget for this year to take care of the ministry, especially the staff and their salaries and things. Well, let's get started with the study for tonight. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Do you remember where we left off last week, where Paul said, because of the content of deference, the topic of deference, where you defer to someone else, you defer your rights, in this case, to do something that you know is not necessarily bad, but to not cause someone to stumble, you yield your rights for their betterment. And then in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 8, Paul said, therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. And again, that's a pretty big thing, especially realizing Paul doesn't exaggerate, so much so, he's about to get into chapter 9, an example that they would be familiar with. And it's interesting for a few reasons that Paul uses the example that he does. We'll get into some of that as we go through it. But he goes through an example in 1 Corinthians 9 of how he has done just this. He has yielded his true rights to certain things. In this case, mostly his support, his financial and practical support. He's yielded that for their good. And he goes on then to demonstrate, this is how I exercise my yielding of my liberty, of my rights for your betterment. And what's interesting also about this example is that his refusing or not taking pay or full pay or whatever was likely, based on the way some things are phrased here, likely offensive to the church at Corinth, because it does look like there's a lot of information to support some of this, but it looked like typically if you had your philosopher, or in this case your pastor, your minister, your apostle, you took care of them, and that was something you took pride in. You took care of them. They were all right. They didn't have to go work a manual job in particular. They wouldn't have to work with their hands, is literally something that was dealt with that they never had to do, so that they could be taken care of, and you were kind of proud of that. And here Paul's not doing it with them. He also didn't do it with the Thessalonians, and I believe probably because for other practical reasons, they seem to have a pretty good attitude. They probably just couldn't afford to meet his and his team's practical needs, but he kept on doing it. So that's the example he's going to use. So he's going to use it in a multitude of ways to demonstrate his use of not exercising his rights. So let me read verse 13 again, and then go right into chapter 9 here. Verse 13 of chapter 8, therefore food causes my brother to stumble. I will not eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord, which was part of the absolute requirements of being an apostle? Are you not my work in the Lord? Didn't I start this ministry there? If to others I am not an apostle, because apparently there was some debate over this, that, well, other places don't recognize your apostleship, but what does he say? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is what I did as an apostle, and he came to Corinth and he found an interesting relationship he had with this church. Clearly it was stressed. This is almost as though, whether you like it or not, you're my seal, you're my proof of my apostleship. I'm the one who started it there, even though it looked like they had quickly transitioned into, even like the churches at Galatia struggled with, but they transitioned into something where they were more embarrassed, to say the least, about Paul. Couldn't they have had a more prestigious, better looking, better speaker, more talented or whatever person to represent them, rather than someone who apparently didn't look that well and couldn't speak that well, and they were a bit embarrassed. That's at least what it looks like from other texts. So then we go on. Verse 3, my defense to those who examine me is this. So those who are criticizing in a scrutinizing way, here's my defense. Do we not have a right to eat and drink? In other words, have our needs met? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas, that's Peter? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working because they didn't have to go support themselves in the ministry? And Paul saying, so everyone else, all the other apostles, they're fully supported. Is it just that Barnabas and I are the only two that have to earn our living to make it so that we can be supported? And again, he's using this not to criticize support or not. This is not, the main point of this text isn't to make a case for supporting a minister or not. This is the example he uses of how he's not exercising this right. Verse 7, who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about the oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it is written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of what? Sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? So he's making the case that this was a normal thing, and it's to be expected like any other job out there. If you're working to this end, for this group or whoever you're working for, isn't it your expectation that you're going to be taken care of? That these needs are going to be met? And of course the answer is supposed to be, well, yeah. But why is he saying all of these things? Verse 12, if others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Now, we don't know all the reasons that this is stated, but this was his reason of why he wouldn't do it. For some reason, if he would have taken their support, if he would have been taken care of like most of them would take care of them, it would have somehow, in his estimation, been a hindrance to the gospel. So for their sake, for their betterment, and even though it looks like they didn't like this at all, he refused to utilize this right for their good, which now plays off of what we were studying in chapter 8, where I could eat meat offered to idols, but for the sake of someone who struggles with this for whatever reason, I won't do it. I'll yield that right for their betterment, and now he's letting them know, here's why I'm not accepting or I'm not taking support from you, even though I have every right to it. And even though it looked like possibly that they would be supporting other people that were coming in like super apostles, though a lot of that's speculation. So verse 13, do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, speaking now of the Old Testament practices there, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? Don't you know that's the way it always has been, as God set it up? They are your ministers, they are serving God, and so you take care of them, or they're taken care of. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. That's how it was set up. But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case, for it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one. This leverage point. It wasn't like he was bragging necessarily over this, but this was a point he had over them for some reason. And I would rather die than someone be able to take this away. That somehow it was because of their support, their financial support or whatever, that they made Paul who he was. Now, what fascinates me about some of this even when we start speculating a little bit further into this, they don't seem to think much of Paul anyway. But I think a lot of churches have done this in the past, where they say, well, look what we've made of somebody and how we've built them up, and this person's well known because of our support and things like that. I don't think we see that a lot, but it's come up before. Verse 16, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more. And there's where I'm going to stop in our reading ahead. There's my strategy. I'm doing this for the betterment, for the advantage, for the cause of the ministry to do this. Because it's true, any pastor or minister or teacher or whatever that's truly ministering in the Lord's work for the sake of the gospel has the right to be fully taken care of. But then you start to get into other, well, does that mean every pastor or whatever should insist on this? Every missionary should insist on this? No, absolutely not. And for the same reasons Paul didn't insist on it also. He didn't insist on it for whatever reason, but mainly so that it wasn't to some degree a hindrance to the gospel. Like a lot of pastors who would come in and just be a burden to a small church to say, no, I need, to have this much money and you got to take care of me across the board, and that would not be for the sake of the ministry. That would not be the cause. Though I've had pastor friends in the past that have made a point to say, no, here's what you insist on, and here's the percentage you make, and you look at your people in the church and you see what they're generally making, and you don't have to be the top, but you need to be up there as far as the general income of the church members, and they've got it all worked out like you would any good business thing. And all I can think of is, that's not a minister's heart at all. I mean, Paul was even saying he'd do it for free, because he does it for the sake ultimately of the gospel, and he knows ultimately what the reward is, and that's the reason that it's done. So it's an interesting illustration that Paul's using here. It fascinates me how oftentimes you'll hear pastors, or at least in pastor seminars or other materials, where they'll use this text to really try to make a case for being fully supported by their congregations. And I'm thinking, You don't want to miss the main point, because what's the main point in 1 Corinthians chapter 9? I have the right to full support, but I'm not going to use it for your sake. How come you never hear that come up in somebody's usage of this text that's out there? You do, and you should. And was that the standard that was out there? Sure was. But there are exceptions to this and varying reasons for this, and that's what we're focused on here. What would be the reason not to exercise a particular right? And now Paul, rather than criticizing the church at Corinth, he's using this as an example for the betterment of others. I'm yielding this right. Now, you do the same. Don't look at me and say, oh, what a great example that is. He wasn't bragging in that sense. He was doing this to serve as an example. I practice what I preach. I'm yielding a particular right, one that you all know I have a right to. And I'm not exercising, and apparently Barnabas was pulled under that as well, because apparently, from the way it was stated here, he and probably others on their team had to earn their living another way. Most likely Paul was working with animal skins and ultimate things like leather working or tent making, things like that. That's where we get the concept. So there's so many things here. You can't just use this text to say every church should fully support their pastor. That may not work, and there may be varying reasons why it's not the case. And that's what we're focused on. What's the reason here? The reason here is Paul's example of yielding a right. Now, we all look back at an example like this and say, yeah, he had the right, and he yielded for the betterment of others. And that should be our takeaway point. I have rights to a lot of things, right? Can make a case for it, but I'm going to yield it up ultimately for the sake of the Lord's work, whatever it is in each of our capacity. Because he's certainly not doing this to make us all like we're all pastors or anything like that. He's using it as an example. So on page 47, just a little underneath the middle of the page there,
This is point 21. Paul's personal example of yielding his rights for the benefit of others. So just to jump right into this, point A, having just made a statement that he would be willing to sacrifice eating meat for the protection of a brother, he now goes on to demonstrate his own sacrifice of his own rights to be supported. That's the point. Let's not get too far off track here. That's the main point. He had a right to be supported. He yields that for their betterment. He says this as an example. Number one, Paul's unquestionable freedoms and his authority to claim them, especially his right to be supported. This is in the first couple verses. So he asks some questions. Am I an exception, or am I not free? In other words, can't I do as I please? Is it somehow, and this is an odd thing, is it somehow that now that I'm in ministry, I'm now less free than everybody else? I think there's a lot of people and a lot of congregations and a lot of other ministries over the years that seem to think that's the case. They think that somehow you're less free than everybody else. Well, Paul's saying, no, I'm just as free as you are. That hasn't changed, right? But again, he's not going to claim this freedom. So let's be careful how we handle these phrases. Can't I do as I please as a person, as a Roman citizen, and especially as an apostle? Was he not free to occupy his time as he would choose? Could he have authoritatively claimed the right to not have to earn his income somewhere else? Yes, he could have. That's the point. And now he's going to use that to say, but I yielded that right. Off to the left with all his privileges, he would yield them for eternal purposes because his focus was on his responsibility before God more than on his comforts and his pride. Well, look at all these other people out there getting supported, and look at their incomes, and look how they're treated. It's one thing I never liked in any capacity with any of the other pastor groups I was ever around, where they would kind of say, well, my church gives me this much money, and I've got this special fund here that they take care of me, and they buy my car for me every other year, and why would this kind of conversation ever come up amongst pastors? It's such a sad, pathetic thing to see. Because then you look around and you realize there's a lot of these other men out there who have just a heart for ministry, and they're in these tiny little poor areas, and these people can't do this. What are you doing to these people? Making these types of comparisons. This is a horrible thing to do, to belittle these. And of course then pastors start to get the same mentality a lot of people do in the business field. You work your way up. You start small, and then you look for another church that's a little bit bigger, and you look for another church that's a little bit bigger, and another, and soon your ultimate goal is to be one of these pastors that's a pastor of a large church, and you're making a lot of money, and you got all these ministries out there. That kind of thinking doesn't belong in the church at all. It's a shame that it does. But I'm quickly getting off track because that's not the point of the text here. Point B is an apostle, which he makes a case here. Could he not be able to establish and to some degree enforce certain rules? So Paul could say, and rightfully say, because it was the truth, he could say, I am the boss of you. Like we say, well, you're not the boss of me. He could say, well, yeah, actually I am. I am the boss of you. I am in charge of you. I do have authority over you. But he wasn't going to utilize that authority in that capacity, because it's true that that's the case. I know these days it's not looked upon anymore that church elders are actually leaders and the people who are in charge, who are authority, but it actually is the case. They are. But it's never meant to be, as Peter warned, never use it, the authority that you legitimately have, to lord it over your people. But by the way, just as a defense, it doesn't mean then that as you serve the people, they lord it over you, because that seems to be what's happened over the years, where this church leadership is flip-flopped, and now the pastors, the elders, whatever, answer to the people. And that's not true. There's not a biblical case for that at all. So that's not true either. Even though some might say, well, we pay your salary, and that's a terrible thing for a church to ever get into, to say somehow, well, I pay your salary, like a taxpayer would say, I pay your salary as a civil servant, you answer to me. It doesn't work that way in the church, not in any capacity. So Paul, as an apostle, could enforce certain rules, yet he would choose not to, and would act then more as a servant than a boss to them, at least in particular here to Corinth, though he would get fairly direct with them. But he would act more as a servant rather than as just a boss lording it over the people. So point C, among his other credentials as an apostle, he had seen the risen Lord, as we read just a moment ago, which was one of the requirements in being an apostle, and that's detailed more in Galatians 1, 11 through 17, which he reiterates to those churches to make a point of his authority in his conversion, meeting the Lord personally. That's Galatians 1, 11 through 17 for more on his beginning and ultimately his call. You can also see that in Acts 9. I have that off to the left there. So point D, then, to the Corinthians specifically, he asks, are you not my work in the Lord? Isn't this how you came about? God sent me there. You're the work he gave me. The church was established. This is where you came from by means of my ministry, my calling. Isn't that where it came from? And of course the answer, these are supposed to be rhetorical. They're supposed to know the answer to these questions. Well, yes, that's the case. It's interesting how Paul fights for his legitimacy and his authority only to then say he's yielded it. So the rest of point D there, as if to remind them that their hearing of the gospel and that their coming to Christ was through him. It was in the Lord, and certainly not by the genius of himself or the strength of his person. It was in the Lord, but it was still Paul. That was the one Christ had used. Even if others did not recognize his apostleship, which it looks like some were trying to make a point of, they should recognize it being his, as he used the word seal, which just basically meant his proof of his apostleship just by their very existence as an established church. He was sent out to set up the church. So that's, in a synopsis, what he was saying there. Off to the left, could he not make a moral appeal to receive special attention from them? Yes, he could. He could say, you have forgotten I'm an apostle. That alone demands a special respect, which it did. It did. But he's not pushing that. No doubt many today would come alongside if they had the chance and say, you really ought to just push it. People don't typically respond well to that, but neither do you do the extreme and just roll over and play dead. We answer to the Lord, and the authority is his ultimately. That's why someone who's in church leadership can't yield it to the people, because it's not ours to give. It's not ours to give. It's the Lord's. Point number 2, in case there are those questioning his practicing, what he was stressing to them, now he gives some more examples here. Point A, Paul was not running from scrutiny. This examining that he mentioned here. He was not running from scrutiny, but was welcoming it and then defending himself. I'm not afraid of those scrutinizing. Let them scrutinize now, but let's look over the facts. There's all kinds of critics out there. It's amazing to me how I've seen this a lot in my lifetime in varying degrees, where there will be critics out there who aren't interested in any kind of defense. I just want to criticize, and as far as I'm concerned, my critical thoughts concerning somebody in a particular point of ministry or whatever, it just goes. You're not to answer back. You're not to defend. And if you defend, as far as I'm concerned, you're just even more guilty, as though people in spiritual leadership answer to the people. This is something we've got to come back to grips with, I suppose, that pastors, spiritual teachers, elders do not answer to the people. They don't. And that's not a defensive thing. That's not a dictatorial thing. This is a very scriptural thing. And if people forget that, it's not going to do anybody any good, certainly not a congregation any good. Now, this is now Paul saying, I have every right to do this and could enforce it to the letter and still be right, but I'm not doing it for your good. But that, of course, should not be exploited, which it looks like some were trying to do in Corinth. So Paul wasn't running from the scrutiny, he was welcoming it and then using it to defend himself. So point B, when asking, do we not have a right to eat and drink This was a way of saying, don't we have a right to be supported in our work? That you'll take care of our basic needs. In Corinth, and most other great cities of their day, teachers and philosophers and other vocations like that provided that they need not work with their hands, is one way that it's phrased elsewhere. In other words, they don't have to do physical labor to support themselves. And there was a pride thing associated with this. I don't think that's what Paul was utilizing here. That's my note off to the left. For most of these, what we would call in the white-collar section of work, these white-collar vocations, it would have been looked down upon to do manual labor. It is believed that some in the Corinthian church were ashamed of Paul for not taking their support and for his manual labor. Not only did he have another job, he had another job where he worked with his hands. And they looked down upon that for their teachers. They don't look down on for people in general. It was a good thing to have a job and to work with their hands. But not our teachers, not our philosophers, not our apostles. They shouldn't work with their hands. So that was at least some of the background there. Point C, he also had the right, we could call it, since it would be one way it's phrased these days, his work benefit, of having a wife and family, and he would have a right to their support, top of the next page, yet he did not have a wife, and thus did not require support for a family. He alludes to the other apostles, though, and ministering brothers doing so, and even Peter was fully supported and brought his family along, his wife, and whoever else had to be supported. It would have then been normal and expected for Paul to do the same. That he would say, I'm coming in, and if I have family or whatever, you take care of them. You're doing it for the other apostles, the other ministers out there and their teams. Now you need to do the same for me. But again, Paul's going to leverage this to say, I don't utilize this right. So it would have been normal for them to expect this, but he yielded this right for a reason. Off to the left, Paul is not making a case for ministers of the Lord to not be supported. I felt like I better say that. He's not now saying, well, based on 1 Corinthians 9, you pastors now, some people might come along say in their examining, scrutinizing way, you ought to read 1 Corinthians 9. Why don't you be like Paul and refuse payment, refuse support? That's not the point either in this text. It was the right to it and the responsibility they normally had to do it that he's yielding that makes the very point here. So he's not making a case for ministers of the Lord to not be supported, but is illustrating his exceptional case with the Corinthians. He also did something similar in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. More will be explained on this in verse 12 of this chapter. So point D, he references then that he and Barnabas, they were working in that they had a right to refrain from it, this physical manual labor, so as to be focused upon the ministry completely, as we saw in the situation in Acts chapter 6. Why do we have the account in Acts chapter 6? Because the apostles, the other leaders, couldn't take the time away from the ministry and the word and the teaching and prayer to go meet the practical needs. But the practical needs needed to be met, so they chose servants among the people. We often reference them as the first deacons to minister and take care of the practical needs so that the apostles and those associated with them could spend their time focused mainly on the word, teaching, and prayer. Point E, Paul was not bringing these specifics up for some special recognition, but he was bringing it up to serve as an example of his sense of obligation, in this case, for the gospel, for the Lord ultimately. It wasn't even for their sake in the sense of, well, they should appreciate this. That's another important thing when we're thinking about yielding our rights. He wasn't doing this so that they would look on and say, oh, Paul, we appreciate you even more. That wasn't his motive. Why was he doing it? He was truly doing it for the sake of the gospel. What does that mean to us? That when we do something like this and we yield our rights, it is never for the purpose of recognition. That someone would say, oh, I see what you've done there. we appreciate you even more. Oh, what a great person you are. No, why did he sacrifice these rights? For the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the Lord's work, not for their appreciation, or their recognition, or anything else like that. That's an important point to remember, because it's easy for us to say, well, I did make a sacrifice and nobody cared. That's not why we make a sacrifice. That's not why you and I sacrifice, because we want and need people to care, and if they don't care, then it was a useless sacrifice. We sacrifice for the cause of the Lord, and he is the one that sees and knows all these things, even if nobody else ever notices. That's true for all of us, and a fabulous example for us to keep in mind. So it was for the sake of the gospel, and the gospel not to be hindered in the least by himself. I don't want to hinder the gospel at all, which is why, for whatever reason, we don't know all the details, but he would not take their full support at least. This, then, was to be emulated by them as well with each other. This is why he's bringing it up. Paul was acting truly as a leader. This is what a leader does. A leader is not a boss. A leader leads. That should be clear as it can be in English. It should be clear to all of us. A leader leads, which means you're out front, setting the example, doing it yourself, and then others will follow your lead, right? That's not a huge point for us. We know this, right? But we forget it, because a lot of people get into positions of leadership, and they don't lead. I was talking to someone actually this morning, and their complaint about someone that was in an authoritative position was saying, you know, this person is just a boss, but is a pathetic leader. That was the assessment this person made. This person is a boss, but is a terrible leader, and that's a problem. They won't lead. They just tell everybody what to do. Well, that's a lot of people. That's why they want to get into positions of leadership so they can boss, but that's not the point. We lead by example, yielding our rights for the benefit of others. This is a tough one, isn't it? Does this sound like something we're all just, oh, I couldn't wait till we got to 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 9. This is wonderful. I'm just so inspired. Yielding my rights. Oh, no. People want to claim their rights, at least their perceived rights, and tell me what rights I have, and tell me the respect I'm supposed to get. Tell me the appreciation I'm supposed to get. And then we come to Scripture, we come to church, we fellowship with other believers, and we don't get these things met. People don't compliment us. People don't brag on us. People don't appreciate us. And we think, well, this isn't right. This isn't Christianity. Actually, this is exactly what Christianity, interestingly enough, is. Part of the core Christianity is doing things and not being appreciated for them. So much of Christianity, true Christianity, is yielding your rights for others and they not even knowing it or caring. It's loving and not being loved. That is basic Christianity. Do you see how that just doesn't fit anymore? Who wants to hear that? You have a right to be loved. You have a right to be appreciated. And we're going to do everything we can as a ministry to watch any good thing you do. And we're going to come up and praise you with all the things that you've done. And that's been a pretty much common pursuit and authority in a lot of our church ministries now. People expect it. People get addicted to it. It's almost like a drug. And they think, well, my church doesn't appreciate me anymore, so I'm going somewhere else. And of course, you come to some other church and think, oh, a new person, let's treat them like they're royalty. And then that wears off after a while, so you go somewhere else where they'll treat you like royalty. Absolutely the wrong reason to go to church. Not even close as to the reason why we go to any church. But that's almost laughable now if we're just brutally honest about the state of the so-called church these days. Why do people go? Well, one thing's for sure. They go so they'll be appreciated. And I go to this church over here because they appreciate me. No, that's not why we go to church. That doesn't give us a solid place to exercise true Christianity. Isn't this astounding to think about? It doesn't fit the church model at all anymore. Well, the church doesn't appreciate them. That's not why you go to church. You go to church to appreciate, but you don't go to church to be appreciated. And I think appreciate's a pretty interesting word even in English, because it has to do with value. We want things to appreciate, right? Well, then we ought to go to appreciate, but we dare not come, ever, with any thought of being appreciated. Does it mean we'll never be appreciated? Oh, no, we will be, for all doing our job right, but none of us comes with the expectation of, you had better appreciate me. That's not right. We come and we give it up. I have a right that seems like a general right that people should appreciate me and treat me right, but I'm going to give it up. Actually, we don't have as much a right to that as we think we have, but let's at least pretend like we do, and then we'll yield it up. That's a place to start. See, isn't this fun? No, it's not fun at all. But it's so freeing when we realize, that's right, I don't want to get bogged down in this. No wonder we're all miserable, because we all have all these rights and nobody's meeting them. And we don't call them rights probably anymore now, we call them needs. I have all these needs, and nobody's meeting them. And if a skeptic came in, if an atheist came in, they would say, you're making a better case for no God than I am. Because your God said, and you even said he'll supply all your needs, and all I hear is, your needs aren't being met. Who's the person who's really making my case for me, the atheist might say. And I think we'd have to say, well, I suppose, I guess we kind of are making your case for you. My God shall supply all my needs. And then we go to talk about it, no, my needs aren't being met. Well, whose responsibility is it? Now there's where we drift off course, and while we start to realize, my focus is off because I looked on you and said, you need to meet my need. And that's how Christians look on each other. That's how we look on our families and our relationships, how you meet my need. And I'll meet yours, but there's a cost. You will meet mine. And hopefully about the same level. No, as nothing in common with true Christianity. Now let's see how far this flies in popularity. It didn't go over well then. It's not going to go over well these days. But it's the truth, and it is so freeing and fulfilling. And it's freeing in the sense that we're not bogged down with a wrong motive. And in my heart's not pivoting on people, it's pivoting on God. I'm thrilled with responsibility, not for compliment and praise and appreciation. I don't need that. I really don't. And the pitfall is when I start to think that I do need it. I don't need it. And I dare not let myself start to think that I do need it, because that would be an accusation against my Father, that he doesn't love me enough. And that's always evil. So the rest of the point there, Paul was acting truly as a leader. And how do you know that? As one who leads by going out first. He goes and does it first, so others will follow. And does it even if others don't follow. That is true leadership. I do what needs to be done, I set the example, and woe is a leader that stops and says, well, I'm leading. Nobody's following, I give up. That's still not leadership. We still follow, though none go with me. We still are consistent, though no one else is joining with us. And we never expected the need of it anyway. We appreciate it. I'm glad that others will walk with me in a pursuit or whatever, but we don't need it. If we get it, we're grateful, but we don't need it. They're going out first so others will follow, not barking out orders from the rear, as so many bosses and managers do in our day. Barking out orders from the behind the line, you get out there, get to it, because their bosses are doing the same thing to them. Off to the left, yet he was seeking nothing from them except compliance with what was being taught, because it was of the Lord. He wasn't even looking, do it out of respect for me. Do it out of respect for God. There's just too many people that will look on the human element and say, well, I don't respect you. You don't have to respect the person. But if it's truly what God is saying, we'd better respect God. I think a lot of people excuse themselves from things clearly from God, of God, because of the instrument God uses to give it to them. Well, I don't respect that person. doesn't matter. I mean, it probably matters in the sense of recognizing the Lord's structure of authority, but in the true scheme of things, as far as obedience, it doesn't matter. If we truly honor God, if we truly fear God, we'll keep his commandments, however he gets them to us, even if it's not the most naturally respectable instrument that God uses, as seemed to be the case with Paul. So point F, if this is not enough, he further illustrates with the example of a soldier. It is expected that a soldier, or is it expected that a soldier support himself in his soldiering? Well, you're out and, you've joined and we've got you out and we're going into war. Now, you're going into war. Well, who's going to feed us? Who's going to give us our clothing? Who's going to give us some protection? Oh, you've got to earn that. You would think that's crazy. Certainly one of the things you expect as being a soldier is that you're going to have at least your basic needs taken care of because you're putting your life on the line. So Paul uses that as an example as well. Don't you think that they have a right for these needs to be met as a soldier? Paul was most certainly a soldier on their behalf. He was protecting and defending them in their spiritual growth and in their walk. This is supposed to be one of the job descriptions of any spiritual leader, whether or not people appreciate it or they want it or they're even looking to support it. A spiritual leader is a protector. Is a protector. That's one of the primary responsibilities. We read that in the descriptions of the requirements of an elder in Titus. They are there to protect and to defend the faith, not to please the people. This should be, again, Christianity 101. Pastors, elders, teachers, parents, counselors, we are all to look on ourselves in some capacity as protectors. Again, parents is always a good one to go to. It's nice, most of us to some degree, because we are either parents or we were children, and we kind of get the picture either way, that that's the job of a parent. Does a parent go and say, "Child, how dost thou want me to protect you this day? What are your demands that I do for thee today?" You would think, no, that's not a parent. What does a parent say? "You're not going to do this." And a child says, "Oh, I want to do it." "You're not going to do it because I'm here to protect you. I'm here to keep you safe. That's why I'm doing it." And the child doesn't get it. Does a parent yield because the child doesn't get it? No, the parent stays the parent. The parent insists on it, even though the child may hate them, in the moment at least, may weep and cry and think bitter thoughts against them. Does that faze a loving parent? Of course it doesn't faze a loving parent. Because a parent's not doing this out of love for themselves and think, "Well, I don't want to have kids if they don't love and appreciate me." No, why does a parent ultimately become a parent? To love their children. Imagine the parent that says, "Well, yeah, I'm going to love them, but they better love me back." You're thinking, that's not a good mix for a parent, is it? I'm only having children to have someone love me. Boy, that would be scary to hear someone as their main motive, their core motive for being a parent. No, a parent to protect and love my children. Even if they don't love you back, absolutely. It's actually one of the best demonstrations of love we ever show is when they're just these little tiny things and they have a huge temper built into them and they're about as ungrateful as any person in humanity can ever be, and yet you still take care of them, you still meet their needs, you still protect them because you love them. Well, we get that with parents. Why don't we look on that in any of our spiritual responsibilities? In any kind of spiritual authority or whatever responsibility, that's a good word, that we have over someone else. That's why I put pastors, elders, teachers, parents, counselors, things like that. Off to the left, many are more patriotic towards their earthly homeland than their heavenly one, and is evidenced in their lack of interest in investing in their own spiritual growth. They won't invest in their own spiritual growth because we're more interested in our earthly homeland. I don't have time to put too much in the whole spiritual, eternal citizenship in heaven because I'm too busy trying to take care of my earthly homeland, my earthly circumstances. And so it keeps taking a lesser and lesser priority in our lives because we're too busy trying to keep things in order here when we're not even citizens here. Not in the fullest, most important sense. Point G, one who plants, another example, and keeps a vineyard, a farmer of sorts, naturally would expect to partake of the harvest. If you're working out the land, certainly one of your expectations is that you're going to partake of the harvest, the growth that comes out of it. Paul was one tilling the ground. Paul was one planting the seed. The Word of God is illustrated partly in Matthew 13. So point H, another similar example, one tending the flock, would be expected then to use the milk to partake of that. With each of these, it would be recognized as normal to receive payment for their labors. The Corinthians may have struggled with considering Paul and Barnabas' work as legitimate work. They may have been struggling with that, but again, do we estimate our value of our service for the Lord in any capacity? Do we estimate its value on how other people estimate its value? Better be careful how we answer that one. You all know the answer to that. Well, we better not. But so many people do. Well, I know I'm doing what I ought to be doing before the Lord, but people don't appreciate it. People don't recognize it. But that's not why we do it. If it's truly of the Lord, then we do it to do it. And we don't get all frustrated because people aren't supporting it or complimenting it or whatever, or even appreciating it. The Corinthians may have struggled with considering Paul and Barnabas' work as legitimate work, or more likely, they belittled him for not demanding it. This is why I find it such an interesting illustration for Paul to use, because it looks pretty solid, pretty reliable, that this was something the Corinthians resented of Paul, that he didn't come and demand it of them, because he could have. And any other respectable leader out there, certainly these super apostle-like people coming in, they certainly would demand it. You know what degree I have, and you know the experience I have, and you know the wisdom I have. Do you know what I'm bringing to you? This certainly deserves full support, maybe even a little exorbitant, to take care of. And then you can go to other people and say, look how well we take care of our apostle. Look how well we take care of our pastor. Or something like that. No, it has nothing to do with the reason why it's done. And yet so often it's exactly that way. They may have belittled him for not demanding it, as would be expected from other philosophical and educational positions. Off to the left, though, either way, even if we don't know all the particulars, we do know this: Paul was being looked down upon by many. He apparently did not compete with the celebrities of their day. If only we had a more popular, well-spoken, good-looking, commanding presence kind of guy. We could brag on him. Don't have much to think about. It's funny how some of the thoughts go back to my mind many years ago when I first started doing handouts. Somebody in the church was pretty enthusiastic about it, a young man. And he was kind of enthusiastic about it, and he took my notes, and he went out to go show off, look at what we get at our church. And the people he showed it to were very unimpressed. And they came back and was kind of disappointed to share the news. It didn't make me feel any better either, I'll be honest with you. But to come back and someone to say, oh, they weren't impressed. Actually, someone said, doesn't that belong in a school or a seminary? I'm doing that in a church. Who would ever put up with that? Well, that's not why we do what we do. And people don't have to appreciate it or think anything the better of it. It's easy to become disheartened when it doesn't look like there is any value given to it. But the disheartenment only comes for any of us when our focus is on other people and not why we do what we do. It really, this is no exaggeration, should be enough to do what we do for the Lord's sake. And we find full fulfillment in that and joy in that. It really ought to be the case. People so often are driven to seek the prestigious over the best. And I fear we are there solidly in most of our church ministries, even in our very conservative, biblical exegetical areas of ministry. We are looking for the prestigious over the best. Let me just introduce the next point here, because we've only got a few minutes. The case scripturally for remuneration, getting paid back or for your services, of those performing spiritual service. Number one, this is verses 8 and on. Having made a human case for being financially and practically cared for, the soldier, the farmer, things like that, the tender of the flock, it just makes sense they should be taken care of. So having made a human case for being financially and practically cared for, Paul now makes a case for it in verse 8 using the instructions and example under the law. He's really making a solid case here of all these rights that he absolutely has a moral right to, and then he's doing all of this. This is what makes me smile. He's making such a solid, waterproof case for all these rights, only to give them up. It's a wonderful use of this example. And if I'm doing it, you better do it too, as far as yielding up rights. Point A, we must not lose sight of what Paul is doing here. He is making a solid case for his rights to be taken care of, all so he can demonstrate his yielding the right for the sake of the gospel with them. Okay, that's where we're headed. Don't lose sight of that. Even though you might be tired or fatigued or whatever, you think you got a right to not have to go through too long a service. We're yielding that up. We're keeping our focus on the point here. He had a solid right, and he's going to do this. He's going to give it up. I don't want to lose sight of that. This is where it's all headed, because this is example for you and I. So if you need help staying focused, think about all the rights that you've been trying to protect over the last week, and then yielding it for whatever God's purpose is at any given time. Off to the left, trying to make a case that true leadership then is not focused on self. This is core also to the point he's making. True leadership, and all of us to some capacity are going to be leaders. It's one way or another, forging a direction for a few, for many, for some after the fact, who knows. But he's making a case that true leadership is never focused on itself. That's a bad leader that's focused on themselves. So point B, the concept of being paid for work or services is not a man-made idea. The whole thing about getting paid for your work is of God. Take, for instance, Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, don't muzzle the ox while he is threshing. It's a text he quotes here. Was this just because, and this is the point Paul's making, was it just because God cared about animals? Or was there something to be learned in what is commonly referred to as being humane? I mean, the point is, people think, well, I don't know. God did give this for the sake of the ox that's threshing. Really? Do we think somebody was going by some oxen and they were reading this text and the oxen heard it and thought, yeah, that's right. We need to be taking, no, they don't even think about it. So Paul's point here, it wasn't for his care of the oxen as much as it was for you. Your care of them also, but then your general care of whatever's doing the work, you pay for it. We do it all the time. Coming back from downtown today, coming back for more work, and my car was running on fumes. Did I just insist that it keep going? No, I yielded to reality. I stopped at the gas station, and I filled it up, and I paid for it. I paid for it because that's how I get around. I pay for that thing to keep moving, to keep going. I don't insist on it. That would be ridiculous. I pay for it. So we're used to that. Certainly is the case here. Jamieson, Fawcett, Brown in their commentary said this, in the humane consideration shown for the lower animal, we are to learn that still more ought to be exercised in the case of man, the ultimate object of the law, and that the human, the spiritual as well as temporal laborer, is worthy of his hire. If we're going to do it for our cars, if we're going to do it for animals, if we're going to do it for other things we expect, if they work for it, they get paid for it, we're certainly going to do that with people. Why would I ever insist you work and you don't get paid? That would just not be right. And that's the point he's getting at. So this is a fundamental right. You work for it, you get paid for it. The workman is worthy of his pay. No one should argue against that. And why make this case to make the Corinthians feel more guilty? No, to demonstrate the magnitude of a fundamental, undeniable right that Paul had, and he's yielding it up. And he's not yielding it up begrudgingly, angrily, holding it against them. He's freely yielding it up for their good, for the sake of the gospel, to serve as an example to them. So let's not lose sight of this as though he's beating them over the head. Well, look at all the sacrifice I'm doing for you. That would still be wrong, because why would we ever do that? Why would I beat somebody over the head with my sacrifice for them? To get something out of it, and that would be wrong. That's always wrong. This is why we say, well, you know what, I've sacrificed for you. Oh, anytime those kind of phrases come out of our mouths, it's like, oh no, I've just demonstrated my motive for why I did it for you. Well, our motive should be as pure as possible. I don't do this to get anything out of it. I do it because it's the right thing to do. I do it out of love for you. I certainly do it out of love for my Lord, without insisting, expecting, or anything to get that appreciation and that love returned, that service back. Boy, that's freeing. If we could be free of those expectations on our part that make us so angry, so bitter, so discontent, because we missed this fundamental point of 1 Corinthians 8 and then the example in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So don't, as we continue on, because I've got to end now, as we continue on, don't look on this example as Paul beating him over the head with, look how nice I've been to you and look how mean you are to me. That would be to diffuse the entire text of its point. Paul was not saying any of these things to get something out of them. He was saying it for the singular purpose of setting an example. Now you do the same. You have, and I can make a case for all these rights, and I have a solid case nobody can argue against, the rights for these things, and I am yielding them up. So whatever case you have for your right, and no matter how strong you can make a case for that right, you yield it up for the benefit of others, and certainly for any cause for the Lord. Kind of boxes us in, doesn't it? Not one we just look on a text as, well, I want to study these texts every day. But this is, again, core to normal Christianity. Not exceptional, normal Christianity. This is what our Lord did. It's what his apostles did. We do the same. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for such profound illustrations, such detail put into this text to make such a solid case for a natural, authoritative right to be yielded up for the benefit of others, for the sake, true sake of the gospel, not requiring or expecting any payment back for it. Please, Father, let this set a shining example for us that we would strive also to follow. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.